Next, a former Israeli peace negotiator talks about the Middle East. Gilead Sher wrote the book Within Reach, the Israeli-Palestinian Peace Negotiations, 1999 to 2001. This event's hosted by the Middle East Institute in Washington. It's about an hour and 20 minutes.
I'd like to welcome everyone. Are we on? I'd like to welcome everyone to the Middle East Institute. Before we get started with today's event, I'd like to encourage everyone to turn off their cell phones or any noise-making devices. Boker Tov, Sabal Khair. My name is Clayton Swisher. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Middle East Institute, America's oldest nonprofit dedicated exclusively to educating the American public on the U.S. relationship with the Middle East, Arab, and Muslim world. 2006 marks MEI's 60th year of operations. And to commemorate and celebrate this milestone, I'd like to invite you all to join us at the National Press Club this coming November 13th to 14th for our annual conference. We have a first-rate lineup of speakers to address the overall theme of new approaches to enduring conflicts, which will cover everything from U.S. relations with the Arab Gulf countries to Iran, the progress of our wartime efforts in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and other topics, including Israel's evolving foreign policy and the enduring human suffering in Sudan. Register online at www.mideasti.org, and I encourage you all to secure your seats early, as last year we had over 500 people in attendance, and we wouldn't want you to be without a seat. I'm especially pleased to welcome you all to today's important event with Gilead Sher, someone I admire very much for his willingness to help me back when I was a struggling grad student doing my own research on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To introduce today's speaker, I'd now like to welcome my dear friend MJ Rosenberg of the Israel Policy Forum, our co-sponsor for today's event. IPF is by far the most important and mainstream Israel advocacy organization here in Washington. They're dedicated to mobilizing American Jews in support of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and sustained U.S. diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. MJ has done an incredible job of creating awareness amongst not only the Jewish American community but key Washington policymakers to further his organization's goals. And the Middle East Institute is honored, MJ, that IPF was able and willing to co-sponsor this event and bring Mr. Sher down from Philadelphia. So with that, MJ, please.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Ambassador Mack and Middle East Institute. Thank you, Clayton Swisher. I have to plug Clayton's book because I will be plugging Gilead's book about Camp David. Clayton, who was a bodyguard, or essentially a security guard at Camp David, wrote a terrific book called The Truth About Camp David, published by Nation Books, which really gives you kind of like the parallel history or the alternative history of Camp David. And it's an absolutely invaluable resource.
I do not pay him.
No, I give that book. I'm always giving that book as a gift to people. I really do. I even gave it to you once. And welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see you here. It's hard usually to get people to come to Middle East events in the summer, in that nothing ever happens in the summer, and it's dull, and who cares about the Middle East? We're all just going to the beach and all that. Well, you know, I always thought that. And I guess now I've learned that the trick is everything in the Middle East actually happens in the summer. I mean, no summer vacation for the likes of us on this issue, even if we try to escape, as I certainly do. We're pleased to have Gilead Sher come here from Israel to discuss today's topic of the Arab-Israeli war. An Israeli negotiator provides lessons for the future. But also we are here in celebration of the newly released English edition of his memoir as a negotiator at Camp David, Just Beyond Reach, copies of which can be purchased downstairs, and television people can do it through Amazon. Gilead Sher was Chief of Staff and Policy Coordinator to Prime Minister Ehud Barak, served as co-chief negotiator in 1999 through 2001 at the Camp David Summit and the Taba talks, as well as in extensive rounds of covert negotiations with the Palestinians. Sher is a founding senior partner in the law firm of Arison, Sher, Abulafia, Amudai and Company, and one of Israel's most reputable attorneys. His main practice areas are project finance, international business ventures, investments and transactions, constitutional law, and dispute resolution. He teaches as a guest lecturer at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he just returned from last night, teaching dispute resolution and negotiations in a time of crisis. Sher's involvement in Israel's peace efforts started during the tenure of the late Prime Minister Rabin as head of the negotiation project at the planning division of the IDF, and as delegate to the talks on the interim agreement. In 2002, he co-authored and published with the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute an Israel Policy Initiative for Unilateral Disengagement. When practicing law, Mr. Sher often participates in brainstorming teams relating to national security. He is currently involved in policy planning bodies, dispute resolution groups, and NGO projects dealing with the conflict. The English version of his book, The Israeli-Palestinian Peace Negotiations, 1999 to 2001, Within Reach, has just been published by Routledge Press. Sher is a colonel in the reserves, a former brigade commander, and deputy division commander in the Armored Corps of the IDF, as well as a military judge. A member of the Council for Peace and Security and the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. He also serves as a board member of the Citizen Empowerment Center in Israel, the Israel-British Business Council, and the France-Israel Chamber of Commerce and Industry. A graduate of the Hebrew University Law School and admitted to the Israel Bar in 1981, Sher completed courses in project finance at Harvard University and the World Bank. A personal note, I saw him during a trip to Israel in April, and April seems like 100 years ago now, and I said something to him at the time that Israel feels pretty good, and just even though things are rough, with Hamas and different, things feel good here. And I've been there so many times, I know the difference between good and bad. And he said, it's not going to be good for long. So on that, it was really a downer, but it certainly turned out to be true. So, okay, welcome, and it's great to see you again.
Thank you, MJ, for this kind and long introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here and privileged to have the opportunity to present my own reflections on the current situation. With your permission, I will start with a few comments on the players in our region and a brief tour d'horizon around us. As you know, nowadays I'm not assuming any official position, and consequently the views that I will express here are not but just my own. At the second part of my presentation, I would suggest we tackle the permanent status issues and the permanent status negotiations of 5 and 6 years ago, namely in Camp David of the year 2000. So let us start with the current situation. Israel left Lebanon in 2000 and Gaza in 2005. These were not occupied territories from there on, yet they served as launching pads for massive premeditated attacks on Israeli populated areas. Israel had to face two connected fronts. In both cases, Israel was the victim of border incursions and border attacks, shellings, and rocket launching. And note that in both cases, Israel withdrew to the internationally recognized boundaries. It was hoped that in its pullout from Gaza and from Lebanon, a new era of cooperation and progress would begin between Israel, Lebanon, the Palestinians, and subsequently, yes, what?
Your mic's not working.
Okay.
Switch it up.
Technical problem.
That's right.
Okay. Got this one. Okay. So it was hoped that in its pullout from Gaza and from Lebanon, a new era of cooperation and progress would become a reality and start between Israel, Lebanon, the Palestinians, and subsequently, step by step, other players in the Arab world would join. But instead of progress, it has been rewarded with terrorism, incitement, suicide bombing, and targeting of its civilian centers. Prime Minister Olmert now just a little bit over 100 days in office, a third of them conducting the war against Hezbollah. When the Kadima party won 29 seats in the Israeli parliament during the general elections, a prominent editor, Israeli editor, told Olmert, in order to step up from politician to statesman or national leader, you need to become either a leader in war or in making peace. Unfortunately, the second challenge occurred. We are now in a major crisis in Israel following the last month and a half, internally political survival struggle with political implications for the Prime Minister, for the Minister of Defense, and for the Chief of Staff of the IDF, and a rising popular campaign accompanied by a harsh debate within the Israeli public. Now, if we take a look into the political agenda of just a few months ago, it had only one prioritized item, and it was the alignment or the pullout from the alignment plan or the pullout from the West Bank, the unilateral pullout from the West Bank. There is currently nothing on the agenda. The alignment plan, for sure, is not on it. In terms of casualties, we have had 36 soldiers and officers killed, dozens wounded, a vast majority of them in the last 3 days of the fightings. Thousands of Hezbollah rockets on Israeli cities and populated areas, an average of 150 to over 200 per day, civilian casualties, thus paralyzing the economy and the daily lives of more than 1 million people for about 5 weeks. I would like to say a few words about the Islamic Jihad challenge. Hamas and Hezbollah, Syria and Iran, as well as bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, are primary elements in the terror networks threatening not only Israel and America, but the entire Western world. They are driven by an extremist jihadist ideology which calls for the immediate destruction of the State of Israel as part of the international menace to wage holy war against the infidel free world. Militant fanatic Islam is becoming a global plague with a terrifying legacy of terrorism. Israel realized decades ago, and more particularly in the last couple of years, that terrorism must be confronted with determination, vigor, and resolve. Along with the US and only just a few other countries, it is determined to ensuring that the supporting regimes understand the price they'll pay internationally will be unbearably high. Terrorism cannot be defeated at the airport gates. We get more and more alarm calls lately, but are we really responding satisfactorily? Do we have a joint, comprehensive, coherent effort of intelligence, information, and action? I doubt it. One of the problems is that in this early 21st century, the Western world is still having illusions about the rule of law in a totally lawless environment. Syria and Iran support Hamas and Hezbollah not only because they share their ideology, but also because they provide Damascus and Tehran with a tool to strengthen the influence of their own regimes and to divert attention from other issues which have exposed them lately to international pressure. Iranian nuclear capabilities and its blunt refusal to accommodate the UN prerequisites in that respect will preoccupy the West in the next months and years. In that context, the last months of confrontations and hostility in southern Lebanon and the Gaza Strip is merely a preparation. If the free world is unable to form a united front against Hezbollah, then it will be unable to convince Tehran that it is truly serious about stopping Iran's nuclear weapons program and the enrichment of the uranium. As Professor Haim Harari, the former president of the Weizmann Institute, once observed, the 22 member countries of the Arab League have a total population of 300 million, larger than the US, and have a land area larger than all of Europe. With all their oil and natural resources, these countries have a combined GDP smaller than half of the GDP of California alone. The social status of women is far below what it was in the West 150 years ago. This huge, dysfunctional Muslim ring, from Mauritania to the Gulf states, creates an unprecedented breeding grounds for corrupt rulers, cruel dictators, terrorism networks, incitement, fanaticism, culture of death, suicide bombers, and general decline. Anti-Israeli and anti-American terror activities are primarily financed by terror states like Iran and Syria, until recently also by Iraq and Libya, and earlier also by some of the communist regimes. Pakistan is Al-Qaeda's hub. These are the safe havens of the fanaticism and murder industry. The outer circle is largely financed by Saudi Arabia, but also by donations from certain Muslim communities in the United States, Northern America, and Europe. It is also a fact, commented Harari, that almost everybody in the region blames this situation on the United States, on Israel, on the Western civilization, on Judaism and Christianity, on anyone and anything except themselves. Lebanon, we have a ceasefire that holds for more than a week now, and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701. Our records show a series of good resolutions on Lebanon that have not been implemented because the Syrians had the power to undermine them. 1701 relies on a still weak Lebanese government, one of the core causes for the war, and it supports it with a still problematic, although some good news in the last 24 hours, still problematic international force. It doesn't deal at all with the issue of the two abducted Israeli soldiers. However, it removes Hezbollah from the south and theoretically strengthens the Lebanese government's capacity to suppress this organization. We've heard recently some pragmatic statements from Lebanese high-level officials. Along with these statements, the Lebanese public opinion increasingly opposed the involvement of Syria. With the termination of the war in Lebanon, Israel should examine the political opportunities which have arisen, and I will elaborate on that in a few moments. As for Syria, it hosts openly in its capital, Damascus, the headquarters of a number of Palestinian jihadist terrorist groups, namely Hamas. The Syrian regime provides shelter and logistical support for Hamas leader Khalid Mash'al, who has been living there for a number of years. From Damascus, Mash'al commands terrorists within the Palestinian territories who carry out ongoing attacks against Israeli civilians, including the bombardment of southern Israel with Qassam missiles and the recent terrorist infiltration and abduction of Israeli soldier Gilead Sher. Syria also provides material support to the Hezbollah, including the direct and unlimited transfer of arms and ammunition through the border crossings into Lebanon. The Hezbollah would not be able to operate in Lebanon without clear Syrian sponsorship. The ceasefire agreement was done without the Syrians. It remains to be seen whether the terms of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 be fulfilled without Syria taking part in it. It doesn't seem likely. Implementation of this resolution will depend significantly on the Syrians themselves. Consequently, Assad must realize that Syria will pay an unbearable price if it tries to undermine this UN resolution. That price could be a joint French, EU, American effort to isolate Syria economically if it is unwilling to end its support for Hezbollah and Hamas. Let me remind you that the Europeans currently provide a critical economic assistance to the Syrian regime. Ambassador Dennis Ross suggested recently that the US exercise much more leverage on Syria this time, considering that the Europeans will now be putting forces on the ground in Lebanon. If Hezbollah is being resupplied with arms and can be reconstituted militarily, he said, those forces will become very vulnerable. The leverage seems to be clear. Let's move on to the Palestinian arena. It is close to 8 months now since the Hamas electoral victory in the elections that Israel has politically and economically boycotted the Palestinian Authority. Israel demanded that Hamas fulfill 3 conditions: recognition of Israel, reaffirmation of existing agreements, and cessation of terrorism. However, it seems that Hamas is unable to accept even one of these 3 conditions because they contradict its basic platform and raison d'etre. That said, the hoped-for collapse of the Hamas government as a result of the Israeli pressure is far from being evident. There is no political alternative to Hamas. Fatah finds itself in a deep crisis, almost evaporating in Gaza. And moreover, the majority of Hamas in the Palestinian Legislative Council means that even the next Palestinian government will be dominated by Hamas. So even if Fatah participates in a Palestinian national unity government, if such a government is established, it will have only a marginal impact on Palestinian policy making. What are then the options, the policy options for Israel? I've mentioned the anti-Syrian voices that have grown louder in the public debate in Lebanon. It might be possible to, not immediately, but in the long run, to negotiate and eventually reach an agreement directly with Lebanon, which neither requires the approval of Syria nor depends on Damascus. I'm not ruling out a setup where the US and the Europeans manage to buy off Damascus, as the Americans did with Libya just a few years ago. Syria will then get out of its political isolation, enjoy an economic boost, and should have some of its interest in Lebanon recognized internationally. Then, the next step towards stabilizing the region would be resuming the Israeli-Syrian negotiations, first in a covert way and then in an open one on a peace agreement. On the Palestinian front, Israel needs a valid Palestinian Authority, functional and operating, and not a paralyzed Palestinian Authority. There seems to be an opportunity to resume the dialogue while reframing the process. One option to use, or to at least explore the possibility of using, is the Saudi initiative of 2002. It needs modifications, of course, but has a potential to serve as a realistic framework for a negotiation process towards permanent status in line of the two-state solution. Finally, the realignment plan. It will not be high on Israel's agenda, as I assume currently, but it is essential that the war in Lebanon does not obscure the need for progress with the Palestinians, whether unilaterally, as Olmert prefers, or through negotiations which would confer obligations on both sides. In every possible political scenario, whether negotiations, unilateral moves, or even maintaining the status quo, Israel needs a functioning Palestinian Authority. I guess on all three fronts, assertive diplomacy, determined actions, and maintaining channels for dialogue, back channels for dialogue, would be advisable. By this, I wrap up my comments on the current situation and go back in time to early 2000. So the question is, what are the essential lessons to be drawn from the negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis at that time? Camp David, which followed intensive preparatory negotiations in Sweden and in Israel, was for Israel an important benchmark in the process, rather than a final conclusion of it. It aimed at bringing about an end to the occupation in a negotiated way, and it was hoped an end to the conflict. The Palestinians' approach to the summit stemmed from a search for historic justice. In addition, it entailed exploiting political negotiations as a phase in the ongoing clashes of cultures, religions, and peoples. There was thus a significant gap in the way both parties conceived of the purpose of the summit in July 2000. This conceptual gap affected the unfolding of events far more than any of the mistakes made by either one of the parties or the mistrust that characterized their relationship along the way. Among numerous such lessons, I would suggest the following. First, there must be preparation of the public opinion, the media, and the consensus, and creating the consensus. The historic compromise concealed in the agreements almost reached at Camp David was not well explained to the respective constituencies. In Israel, commentaries focused on what we were likely to be giving up and yield, rather than the benefits of transformation or the fruits of peace. It seems almost obvious that a concerted effort and attention must be given to continuous, comprehensive public relations, explaining to the public the thinking behind the political process. But this did not happen, or at least not sufficiently. Arafat, for his part, never clearly projected readiness to reach a true compromise with Zionism based on the partition of the land of Israel into two independent political entities. And in the absence of any other directive from above, the ongoing hostility and the wild incitement fell on a fertile ground. It is imperative, therefore, to realize that the negotiations are conducted both at the negotiating table and also away from it, designing the media support and shaping public opinion to sustain the final deal are the major considerations outside the negotiation room. Second, attention must be paid to both sides' perceptions, not just the objective facts. Very often, the key to resolve a dispute that complex would not be the truth or the objective facts, but what's in the heads of the respective parties. And if you talk about the core issues, Jerusalem, the holy sites, Palestinian refugeeism, territory, and security arrangements, these are issues that have a lot of perceptions and a lot of mindset involved in, much more than the reality or the political issues that they entail. So if you mistakenly analyze the other side's perception regarding its own objectives, you will constantly misread its conduct throughout the negotiation process, and that happened. Thirdly, careful thought must be given to the question of process management. Sometimes process management may be as important as the substance and the content of the negotiations themselves. When parties move towards closing such a dramatic deal, the process must be kept very well defined and very strict. A rigid framework is needed with a rigid agenda from which the parties cannot be allowed to deviate. This was definitely not the case at Camp David. Indeed, it started with an orderly procedure of presenting positions, setting out respective interests, and then giving each of the sides their respective assignments. The facilitator hosting the summit got off to a good start. However, there was no systematic follow-up. The mechanism later collapsed, and the business-like, pragmatic atmosphere that had marked the beginning, the very first 3 or 4 days, simply fell away. The process was unclear and too often disorganized. In such situations, therefore, it is essential that the facilitator require both negotiating parties to give their responses at every stage, to dictate a clear agenda, to compose a checklist of who does what, when, and to follow up the implementation of those. This was not done in Camp David, certainly not to the degree necessary. Related to this is the need for the third party to master the details to be able to crack heads. Perhaps the greatest flaw in the American team was that several of its members appeared at times to be less familiar with the negotiation topics and the significance of the material than the president himself. A leader should be concentrating on leadership, setting out principles, general policy, not on the actual mechanics of the negotiations. Because of it, Clinton, although fully committed as he was to resolve the conflict, had to deal with the smallest details instead of keeping his precious time for the three-way meetings with the two leaders and attempting to soften each of their respective positions. Fourth, the permanent status quo issues are all interlinked. It is not possible to isolate any single issue from the others. The approach adopted by the Israeli negotiators was predicated on a readiness to discuss far-reaching ideas for solving all these issues, as long as nothing was considered to be agreed until everything was agreed. For their part, the Palestinian suspicion that Israel was seeking a way to deceive the world and perpetuate the occupation prevailed over any reasonable explanations to the contrary. My fifth lesson is that timing is crucial. Clinton proposals of December 2000 were ready as early as August 2000 or early September 2000. They followed up on as many as 50 extensive daily negotiations, recapping the convergences reached in Camp David between the parties. Had President Clinton presented them then, capitalizing on the momentum still remaining from the summit, I believe the outcome might have been completely different. In the event, a very different momentum of violence was brought into being, and the historic opportunity was lost. Sadly enough, there was no realistic U.S. contingency plan in place, and no fallback or exit strategies prepared in anticipation of the summit's failure. So these are my essential lessons. Peace has been quite often within reach, unfortunately still beyond reach. Thank you.
Mr. Sher, I'm not sure if this is working. I'll grab this mic.
You want mine?
Yeah, I'll take this one. As I mentioned at the beginning, copies of Mr. Sher's book will be available downstairs for purchase at $21 discounted rate. We have time for your questions, and he's been kind enough to agree to answer them. So please, before you're called on, state your name and affiliation.
I'm Rafi Danziger from AIPAC, and I'd like to explore with you further the issue of possible talks with Syria. If I understood it correctly, you suggested that it might be possible to entice Syria away from Iran access to become more positive on 1701, etc., through a package of economic incentives. That's if I understood correctly. Now, I think that if this is a suggestion, then the premise behind it is that the top priority of the Syrian regime is to improve the economic situation of the population. But I think that most experts believe that the top priority of the Syrian regime is self-preservation, which cannot be taken for granted by the Syrian regime. And that is not necessarily the same thing and leads to possibly different conclusions. And there are many who believe that the Syrian regime has failed its population, has failed to provide for its needs, has failed in economic reforms, and has actually managed to survive by finding an external enemy, by working with Iran against Israel, against the United States. Now, if in the future the Syrian regime, as it is now, gets into negotiations and accommodation, then that external enemy will disappear and will have to start providing for the needs of the population. And I think that many people believe that this regime is incapable of doing that, which is why it actually would prefer to continue the confrontation, continue the situation as it is today, and even making it harsher, and maintaining its strategic alliance with Iran, which just formally concluded just last June. So I'd like to get your reaction to that.
Shall I take one by one, or?
Certainly. Melissa?
And just to build on that question, Melissa David, Casino Resources. On Syria, what is your perception that Syria must do first in order to become a partner for negotiations? And is the person of Bashar al-Assad an obstacle?
I'll answer these two questions together, with your permission. Well, unfortunately, we don't have any influence over changing leaderships as we might want in the Middle East. We tried that a few times before. We did not succeed very much. So these are the parties that we have to deal with. And for Syria, what to do first? First, stop the assistance to Hamas and to Hezbollah. Stop the re-equipment and the ammunition providing and the free provision of arms and firearms and other arms to Hezbollah. Secondly, I think, and referring to your question, Rafi, for me, the number one priority is stabilization and not democratization. So when I look at the Syrian regime, and I'm trying to have a wider angle of discussion here, I would like to see America and the EU speaking to Syria about the possibility of disisolating the Syrian regime from its current isolation politically, internationally, within the international community, and with that, helping boost its economy, so that although they would still have Zionism and Israel as an enemy, in order to have a collective kind of animosity that would help in the first stage. At the later stage, I think that the contacts between Israel and between Jerusalem and Damascus should be reestablished, first in a kind of a secret, covert way, and then dealing with what we have been dealing with until early 2000, before the death of Hafez the father. Now, I'm not sure that there is some kind of insurance that this will succeed, but taking into consideration that Syria has kept the border with Israel, at least the Syrian border with Israel in the Golan Heights, very, very quiet since the ceasefire of 74 until today, I would suggest trying that path as well.
In terms of stability, I was wondering if you could comment on Iraq. What effect you think the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq has had on Israel's stability, security in the region, and how most Israelis view the Iraq war? Has it made them safer?
Well, I don't think that many Israelis were that concerned with Iraq lately. Lately, I mean in the last, not a couple of months, but a couple of years. Iraq is a major domestic concern here in the U.S., much more than it is in Israel. I believe that the majority of the Israelis support the actions of the U.S. in Iraq, although knowing the outcome of occupation regimes and of occupation actions in the Middle East, we could have predicted some of the failures and some of the problematic situations that happened in Iraq during the last couple of years, and it seems to me that Israel is, and rightly so, much more concerned with Iran, with Pakistan, and with Syria than it is with Iraq currently.
Yeah, I noticed in the Israeli press there's lots of criticism of the way the war was conducted in terms of the failures to achieve military goals. And a number of commentators have said that one of the primary reasons is that the IDF is now essentially trained to maintain the occupation of the West Bank and not trained as a real fighting force for a kind of almost quasi-conventional threat from the north. And I've seen that started a few days after the war, and it's building. More and more people are saying that. As someone who has a lot of military experience, do you think that is in fact true? And in fact, is it also true that training of the reserves is, since the Netanyahu budget cuts, or maybe before that essentially what Israeli reservists usually went through in terms of keeping up their training and their skills has dropped off considerably, and that's one of the reasons you've had such a difficult time. Thanks.
One more question, and I'll answer two questions at a time.
I'm going back a few years to focus on the other part of your talk. My name is Paul Sham. I'm from the Middle East Institute, formerly the Truman Institute at Hebrew University. I was wondering, well, you're one of the very few people who were actually at Camp David who looks at the narratives of the two sides and says that they have to be taken into account. What you said before about the Palestinians having gone for historical recognition, some people say, well, that means it's not possible to have reconciliation. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that that's something that has to be taken into account in the negotiations. I don't see, unfortunately, this happening on either side. In many ways, the positions have hardened, perhaps except for some degree of recognition on the Israeli side of the War of Independence not having been as pristine as seen. I was wondering if you could comment how this could be part of the negotiating process and how the next negotiations, whenever they should be, could take this into account.
Okay. So first to MJ, yes, you're right. There was quite a large level of criticism even during the very first days of the fightings on the IDF achievements and on the operative channel, operative level. And yes, you're right. The budget is limited, and if you have to focus on maintaining some kind of normalcy in the territory, if you can call it normalcy, then the training of the troops and the focus of the military planning goes there. So it is there and not in other places. As to the external threats, yes, of course they are less preoccupying the military and the planning division in the army. But as you know, this is not the only problem. The main problem is that when you're fighting guerrillas, when you're fighting terrorists, with an army as prepared and as trained, as well exercised as you can, the chances that a large, well-supplied army will succeed in eliminating this guerrilla are quite slim. You've seen it in Vietnam. France has experienced it in Algeria. And we have so many examples from history. So this guerrilla, particularly Hezbollah and the Hamas, but especially and more particularly the Hezbollah, are equipped with top-notch arms and top-notch ammunitions, and they have at least the capabilities of a small army. So I can understand the criticism, but I don't accept a lot of it. Okay. As to the narrative, Paul, of the two parties, narrative is very important. Perceptions are very important, and the image of things sometimes is more important even than of course, the actual meaning of them in reality. If you address correctly the narrative of the respective sides, I think that you can overcome the difficulties in bridging the gaps between the opposing or the conflicting perceptions. I'll give you an example, a more particular example relating to the Palestinian refugees and plight. Back in Sweden in April, May, and June 2000, I believe that Abu Ala, currently the Prime Minister, then the Speaker of the Parliament, Hassan Asfour, a minister then, Shlomo Ben-Ami, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and myself, reached a very good scheme for resolving the Palestinian refugees problem. It consisted of an international commission and an international fund. You won't stand here. Okay. Thank you. And an international fund that combined together with an international concerted effort of funding the compensation for every household of Palestinian refugees and resettling them either in their current places of residence or in the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian state to be established, or in host countries like Canada, Australia, Norway, who suggested each one of them to absorb a couple of thousand refugees. In a schematic way, you would have reached within 8 to 12 years a situation where no one Palestinian refugee would have been left as such, according to UNRWA records. But this non-paper of a couple of pages that was drafted by Abu Ala and myself in Sweden was not enough, because the Palestinians preferred to have their ethos of the Palestinian refugeeism in the wording on the caption of the chapter, of this chapter on Palestinian refugees, and they preferred the wording that would allow their narrative to be reflected much more expressingly or much more accurately than the pragmatic, feasible scheme of resettlement of and compensation to the Palestinian refugees. So, if you ask me in hindsight now, I would think that a little bit more flexibility on our part, without compromising with any of our basic positions and standpoints, would have allowed to get a better understanding of both parties' respective accommodations to this problem. Does that answer you?
Well, I was just briefly, is there any movement towards this? Because I think the movement has been away. I was wondering.
So, but I do think that we need to create such a movement.
I'm Dave Pollack. I'm from the State Department. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate what specifically you had in mind when you said, I think a couple of times, if I understood you, that Israel needs a valid or a viable and effective Palestinian authority to come to terms with. How are we going to get there? Are you suggesting that Israel and perhaps also the United States should should end its boycott of Hamas? Is that the way to get there, or is it some other notion you had in mind? And related to that, if I may, because I think this applies both to Hamas and to Hezbollah, both of those organizations or movements derive some, at least, of their standing from popular elections, from a free election, a democratic election, and have some legitimacy in terms of their own populations derived from that, rather than from just ideology or foreign support or something else. And so I want to ask you what lessons you might be drawing today from an Israeli perspective or from your own personal perspective about democracy and elections and the future of the Middle East and in particular of American policy in the region in that respect. Thank you.
Another question, yeah.
Morning again, Art Hughes, Middle East Institute. I really wanted to follow up on basically on Paul's question. I've seen reference to polling done both among Israelis and Palestinians separately, which indicate that many as 60 to 65% of the population would agree with the Clinton parameters, basically, right, as a package deal, since, as you said, everything is linked to everything else. Do you accept that that is a reflection of the feelings in the communities, and does it have any importance as one tries over time to find a way forward? And of the four core issues, which one do you think will be the most difficult to solve?
$1 million question. Yeah. I'll start with the second question this time. I think that both constituencies understand that the parameters of a final deal or the permanent status between Israel and Palestine would be something along the lines of President Clinton's parameters, along the lines of these parameters, meaning that Israel would have to pull out from the vast majority of the West Bank. From Gaza, it has already done so. There would be a certain exchange of lands, or a swap of lands, or at least a certain compensation or payment for the land that Israel will occupy as an integral part of the state of Israel, the main settlement blocks that are adjacent to the Green Line. Jerusalem, the Western Jerusalem, including the new neighborhoods, 11 neighborhoods that we've built since '67, would be completely Israeli. Eastern Jerusalem would be completely Palestinian, and the old city would be under a special regime in a way that would preserve the possibility to ensure the freedom of worship and the freedom of movement, unimpeded movement for worshippers to the holy sites. The Palestinian refugees will be resettled and compensated, but not rehabilitated in Israel proper, unless in special individual cases of human consideration that Israel, in its sovereign exclusive decision, would have to take decision on. And the security arrangements would be such security arrangements that would allow the guarantee for the security of the State of Israel in the long term, strong, solid guarantees from the U.S. and others. All this said, I can't see any major modification to these parameters that are the result, as I said before, of hundreds and thousands of hours of negotiations between the parties facilitated by the United States. And they reflect the then best judgment of President Clinton of what could be done in order to at least serve as a basis for further negotiations and further detailed negotiations on the issues. So yes, I think that what you said about the polls in the Israeli society and in the Palestinian society is constantly true. We have about 60 to 65% of a constant majority that supports and sustains these parameters. As to the main sticking point, to me, I'm not sure that Rob Malley, who is present here, will agree, but the main sticking point for me is the holy sites and the old city of Jerusalem. This is seems to me to be the main contentious issue, because it relates to religious matters, to emotional dimensions, to psychological dimensions, and to other historic dimensions that are not always politically resolved. So this, to me, is the sticking point of the future negotiations. Dave, I do not suggest to stop the boycott on Hamas, not at all. But I would like to ask ourselves what's the final objective of our policy towards the Palestinians. Both the Israeli policy to completely boycott economically and politically any connections and any relationship with the Hamas or the PA the PA entities, agencies, etc. I'm not sure that you cannot at the same time and simultaneously boycott and talk. I mean, you boycott, you do not have any official formal relationship with the government, you do not maintain any kind of economic ties with the Palestinian Authority, but you do talk. And talking is much less harmful than exchanging, bullets and rockets and suicide bombers. I think that this should be the aim of an assertive diplomacy that at the official level is doing one thing in order to express its dissatisfaction of the policy of the other side, but behind the curtains you can have contacts, you can have a dialogue, and you need to have one, especially in times of crisis, and especially in order not to have a collapsing Palestinian Authority that would not be a viable entity to talk to afterwards if we continue along this path without any compromises on covert or secret talks.
Final here. Can you just say something about elections and democracy?
Yeah, well, democracy in the Middle East, I can't see more than one currently. We've seen democracy, kind of a democracy election in Egypt. How many percentages of the voters voted for President Mubarak? Close to 100, right? I mean, it's democracy is not only a caption. It's a cultural development and a social development and an administrative development of a country. It's a level of understanding of the values of democracy, and not only putting the caption on and say, here are the democratic elections. Because if democracy brings up a leader whose platform is non-democratic, then what? So I don't see that as a first priority, and I would, I'm too humble to give any advices to the spokespersons of your administration. But I think that you guys need to realize that democratization is lower on the list of the Middle East than stabilization, and that speaking about democracy is not enough.
Aviva Meyer with the New Israel Fund. I want to follow up on MJ's question about military planning, because it makes me think about decision-making afterwards. And I noticed that Yoram Peri had an interesting op-ed this morning in the Washington Post. I don't know if you've seen it, from his new book, reminding us that the cabinet discussed all of 3 hours before they decided to go to war. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about decision-making, because surely the military at least knew how they planned, and in that conversation and the decision that they then made to send ground troops later, I don't understand. Perhaps you can help me.
What's the question?
The question is something about the decision-making, and do you think that the way decisions are made in Israel, with the military having an important plan and the prime minister in the position that he was, what happened? Do you have any insight into that?
Okay, next question. Yes.
I have another question about Camp David, about Israeli negotiating tactics. I have never understood why it was that Prime Minister Barak was ready to make concessions later, when he accepted the Clinton parameters, that he has not made in Camp David. And it seems that maybe the Israelis and Prime Minister Barak did not have a clear concept what would be the final concessions, how far they would go in Camp David, that it was not, I don't know if it was not properly discussed, or that they had themselves not a clear picture how far they would go. And otherwise, how would you explain that he made concessions later in the process that he was not ready to make in Camp David?
Okay, I'll answer Aviva first. The military presence in government decisions or in government decision-making process is of course needed when you deal with military issues. I mean, you have the ministers that are sovereign to the government, and the cabinet that are, of course, sovereign to decide. But they need data and information and recommendations from the military in order to decide what to do in cases like the one we've had, in which military action and military reaction was indeed one of the main issues on the agenda rather than diplomatic ones. So the decision-making process in Israel is quite an organized one. You know, it's very well established, well organized, and you do listen to recommendations, to options, to alternatives that are being presented by the military, by the IDF chief of staff and others. You do listen to intelligence reports and to at least assessment of the picture in general, but the decision is taken by the prime minister and the ministers in cabinet or in government, and then there is only the implementation kind of dimension that is once again transmitted to the military. But having said all this, in hindsight, once again, I think that we might have resorted to military action a little bit too hastily this time, and that if we would have put to the to Beirut government an unequivocal demand to return the 2 abducted soldiers from the northern border, and to act upon the Hezbollah as they were supposed to, then a couple of days later we would have a much more solid legitimacy for our military actions. And I think that you always have to first use an assertive diplomacy and a lot of other means of governance and of policy making than resorting to military power too early. If that answers your question, I'm not sure. I have some insights, but I cannot on this podium share it with you. Sorry. As to Camp David, I believe that the strategy of Prime Minister Barak and his government was, from the very outset of its inauguration, was to exhaust every possible effort in order to find a way to terminate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a negotiated way. Having said this in a general manner, the issues in question were discussed thoroughly, profoundly, and in all their aspects between the negotiating parties prior to Camp David. Actually, Sweden and other rounds of negotiations provided quite a good understanding between the parties that there are 10 to 12 issues of leadership, political sort, that have to be decided upon during the summit, and that the negotiating parties, even on the ministerial level or on my level, were far beyond their respective mandates in a way that could not continue in more preparation, because the preparations we knew what had to be decided upon by the leaders, and this was supposed to be done in Camp David during the summit. Otherwise, why to have a summit? You can continue negotiations. I can tell you that in the last round of negotiations that we've had pursuant to the Swedish track in early June, just about a couple of days after the pullout from Lebanon, we set for 3 days, Abu Allah, Shlomo Ben Ami, myself, Hassan Asfour, and a couple of others, and we had nothing to talk about. I mean, we've kind of listed, and the Americans knew that as well, kind of listed all the issues in divergence. We kind of listed the possible points of convergence, and we had a very detailed list of about 10 or 12 issues that were for the leaders to decide together, because these were political, historical, personal decisions to be taken. And Barak knew around what lines he is going to make the concessions. The fact that he accepted and that the Israeli cabinet actually unanimously accepted Clinton parameters, and I've in person provided President Clinton on the 5th of January 2001 with the affirmative answer of the Israeli cabinet. The fact of the matter is that these parameters consisted of the same parameters that were discussed in Camp David and afterwards. And Barak used to say, I would be ready to make those concessions on condition that Arafat gives a similar answer. And in Camp David, you remember Dennis Ross saying quite a time after Camp David, that Arafat in Camp David had only one new idea, just one, that the Temple Mount never existed. There was no reply of any kind from the Palestinian side on the part of Arafat to these basic parameters as the basis for further negotiations. So the strategy was, yes, we are ready to, as a whole, to give up because we are the givers. Okay, we have the territory, etc., and we rule there. We are ready to give up quite a lot. We are ready for an historic compromise, but we need to see Arafat moving towards this compromise and accepting it. Okay.
Isn't it so that in Camp David, Barak expressed less readiness for this compromise, both in Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley, where he later accepted international force, so that he expressed much more readiness later in the Clinton parameters than he did in Camp David?
I beg to differ. I think that President Clinton and his close aides knew exactly where we're heading, and I believe that you need to understand the mechanics of the negotiations. I mean, you don't come up front and say, "Hey, I agree to this, and that. Okay, bye-bye," and wait for the other party to say, "Okay, so these are the starting positions. Let's move on from here." There is the methodology of negotiations is not exactly what you would like to picture here. Okay, so when President Clinton finally came up with his package, he reflected what he knew about the possibility to make a compromise that would encompass the totality of the core issues, the four core issues together, with give and takes in every one of them.
Mr. Mack?
David Mack, Middle East Institute. My question is actually a follow-up to the question of David Pollack from the State Department. And it was a very cautious, careful, diplomatic attempt to draw you out in advising the United States on dealing with the Hamas-led government of Palestine. And you quite correctly, I think, deferred and were modest about criticizing U.S. government policy. So let me ask you in an undiplomatic way about your views of Israeli policy toward dealing with these democratically elected, or at least elected according to a concept of democracy that had international observers, including observers from the United States, attest to. These elected Palestinian representatives who happen to be members of an organization, Hamas, which is illegal in Israel, sanctioned by the United States, but legal in Palestine. And here let me use a non-Israeli perception. You have recently kidnapped a large number of those elected government representatives. It would be nice to think that this was a prelude to having secret talks with them in the secrecy of the Israeli jail. But I suspect that any talks in that venue won't be entirely fruitful. So do you think as a long-term process that this made sense for the Israeli government to take these people in the manner it did and deprive yourself basically of a potential interlocutor on the other side of the line?
That's the most difficult question I've got today, David, and I thank you for it. But I would ask you to bear with me because I won't answer it directly. I would just say in general terms that any government, more particularly the Israeli government, has to constantly reassess its policies and see whether the action it takes serve the strategy of the long term, and whether in the long end you would find a viable interlocutor or a paralyzed, non-existing interlocutor and counterpart for your once you reestablish or recap the dialogue with this party. So I without telling you my opinion about actions taken or policies implemented, I would tell you that there is a need to permanently and constantly reassess the positions and the standpoints which you have and see whether they serve the long-term aims.
We have time for 3 quick questions, and I'm going to start with Hank and work our way forward. Mark.
Stanley Cover with the Cato Institute. How do you assess the balance of power in the Middle East?
Dan Dolan, do you think that the experience with Hezbollah is going to cause the Israeli political leadership to reassess the value of the wall?
I beg your pardon?
To reassess the value of the separation barrier.
Mark Matthews, based on your experience at Camp David and afterward, do you think any Israeli prime minister can seriously negotiate a final status agreement or an agreement with Syria without a solid parliamentary majority?
Last 3 questions. Okay. I'll start with the last question. The answer is no, but the subtext is that if you're elected as a leader, you need to lead, and if you think that this is right for a country, then do it. Then go to a referendum or go to a general election campaign and explain why the political move that you've done is right for Israel. I think that in every junction of history, you would find leaders that were in a minority while deciding what they have decided. Look at de Gaulle in '61, that acted completely in contradiction to the platform of his re-election. Okay. And ordered his negotiator, Louis Jox, get me out of Algeria, okay, get me an agreement. Started in Evian, then afterwards in the Jura Mountains, etc. The story. So to me, this is a general statement, but to me it is clear that any Israeli leader who has been elected has not been elected for just warming up the Prime Minister chair or the desk of the Prime Ministership, and the parliamentary majority might be created at a later stage. What some of the governments put in their previous governments in Israel in their guidelines, namely the Barak government, in the guidelines of the government he was heading, was that once the agreements with the drafts of the agreements with the Syrians and or the Palestinians are ready, they would be put to a referendum, a general referendum. And Barak went to Camp David with a minority government. Okay. assuming that if an agreement is reached, it would become a majority. Okay. As for the separation barrier, the fence has been established because of security reasons, not political reasons, and of course it delineates more or less where a permanent agreement territory-wise could be accepted, but I don't think that it has any major impact on the future of the talks or on the outcome of possible negotiations in the future. I think that it does its job. I mean, there's of course a subsiding of violence that crosses this border, and we did notice much less intrusions and problematic infiltration into Israel since. So I don't think it has a major effect, except for sensitive places like in Jerusalem proper, within the city of Jerusalem.
About whether or not the experience of the recent war changes the security calculations and makes the wall either less or more valuable.
No, I don't think that it has a real impact on that. Question of the balance of power is a very stimulating question. If you mean, if you meant to ask Mr. Caro about the deterrence power of the respective parties in the Middle East, then I think that nothing has really changed. Nothing has really changed. If you meant to ask whether the threats are being recalculated, I would say yes, they are being recalculated in all capitals currently around us, and including in Jerusalem. But I would say the following, and that would be my final comment. I don't think that without a comprehensive, collective effort of the United States, the EU, the UN, Israel, and other parts of the free world, I don't think that without a concerted effort, time is working in our favor. And we need to simultaneously fight terrorism with all the determination and the vigor that is possible. We need to share all the information and the intelligence data about that. But we need at the same time to look for ways to stabilize the region in order not to change the balance of power, which is for the time being in our favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sher. The name of the book is Within Reach, the Israeli-Palestinian Negotiations from 1999 to 2001. As I said, copies are available downstairs, and Mr. Sher will be happy to sign them and answer any further questions you might have. It's an excellent book, and I encourage you, any student of the Arab-Israeli conflict, to check it out. Thank you very much for coming again. Thank you, Mr. Sher. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Coming up, a live update from NASA on Sunday's